Welcome to, believe it or not, the 19th annual meeting of the Raoul Wallenberg Committee.
There was something very special about Raoul from the very start. I idolized him because he was very clever and very bright and very sweet as a person and had lots of humor and full of activity and self-confidence. I don't think that anybody could foresee this enormous mission.
I feel that I owe my life to Raoul Wallenberg. I feel that I owe my family's life to Raoul Wallenberg.
He came to Budapest and he saved people single-handedly like that.
He has saved about 100,000 people by now. It must be 500,000.
He really was a savior, like unto Moses, delivering 100,000 of us from the gas chamber.
And he just saved everybody who he could save. And his life was in danger too.
He was a man who was completely selfless, appalled by the horror of the Nazi regime and determined to put his life on the line.
And he knew no fatigue, no hours, nothing. He was available to talk about something any time of the day or night or do something about it and use, how shall I say, any possibilities. A perfectly dedicated man.
Nobody was safe. And yet, when they started bombing, our Raoul got out. Wherever he was, he always had his bicycle there. He got on his bike and he bicycled to the orphanage because the children need him.
He would come in, and first of all, he was a wonderful mimic. He would try to cheer up the children in the homes, in the orphanage, reassure, literally play with us. And then he'd be gone until he showed up again. So we looked forward to these visits.
Thanks to his personality and all that, and thanks to his status as diplomat, he managed then also at this borderline to save people in bluffing and saying, look here, those people there have all Swedish passports, and we took them back by trucks to the Swedish houses.
My father had heard about this legendary Swede who was giving out Schutzpasses. And he hid my mother in a bombed-out apartment house and went to the Swedish embassy. He did not get caught on the way, and he was lucky enough to find Wallenberg in residence. And within 5 minutes, he not only had a Schutzpass for my mother and himself, but he found out he still had a little girl, and we were reunited. The three of us were taken to one of the protected houses.
We have been concentrating so much on finding out the truth about what happened to him in the Soviet Union. But now I think our task is to say, or ask ourselves, what can we learn from Raoul Wallenberg? What is the message? And to me, the message is that everybody has a chance to be a hero. Everybody has a potential to do something.
It's wonderful so far, and that's, I know, is just the beginning. So thank you for letting us use that today for this meeting. We now are going to turn to our guest speaker, Marianne Balschoen. You saw a little tiny bit of her on the screen just a minute ago. She is a big, tiny little person. We couldn't put her over here at the podium because you couldn't see her behind the podium. So she's going to speak from that side. But I'd like to tell you just to read you something. Marianne's late husband, Benjamin Balschoen, wrote a book called Determined, which he dedicated to Marianne, and in his book, he talked about her life in Budapest and what she had gone through. And I just would like to, he starts with a quote from George Eliot saying, "Our deeds determine us as much as we determine our deeds." And then he says, "Examine carefully the eyes on the child on this cover." Marianne's picture as a little girl was on the cover of the book. "She is Marianne, the principal character of this factual account of determined survivors. Can you visualize this child as a young bride, disdaining the obligatory yellow star, carrying a basket of food brought with gold under strafing and artillery fire, making her way through the streets of Budapest? On her person are 2 sets of papers, Jewish papers that should send her to an extermination camp, and forged ones which unquestionably could have her shot on the spot." With that, I will turn this over to one of our indomitable, wonderful survivors, Marianne Balsha.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this wonderful introduction. It really gives me the shivers, you know, when you quote from the book and you say about the child's eye and Eliot and so forth. Well, my late husband wrote this book. He was not a Hungarian, he was an American. And he listened to my stories and he said, this has to be documented. So since Rachel was kind enough to mention the book, so I'm telling you that I'm very grateful to him that he did document the story, because ever since then, I am telling my story. And this is what really motivated me to talk about our experience and to talk about Raoul Wallenberg, my hero. My name, as you heard, is Marianne Balsha. Can everybody hear me? I was born in Budapest, Hungary, and I'm here today as the living proof and the living witness to the man named Raoul Wallenberg, whose name this association is named after, and who produced such miracles during the Second World War, during the Holocaust in Budapest, that I'm going to relate to you some of the miracles that why I am lucky enough to be here in front of you and speak about him and speak about this survival experience. I was, as I said, I was born in Budapest, Hungary, and as a child I grew up in very nice circumstances, very idyllic circumstances. My parents provided me with the best of everything: schools, music, ballet, concerts, opera, ice skating, and I also studied ballet. And if things would have been different, maybe that's what would have happened. I would have become a ballerina, but things happened differently. Anyhow, I went to the Jewish Gymnasium of Budapest, what is kind of a parochial school, what you would call here, that it's a private school, and it gave me the best of educations, but I only found out really when I came to this country that my education was superb, and actually was, even though I went through the 8 gymnasiums, it was almost like going to 2 years of college too. But of course, unfortunately, I never had the chance to. So growing up like this in Budapest, I had friends, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and we really didn't know much of the difference. Hungary was a very, Hungarian Jews were very much integrated into the mainstream life of Hungary. They were in banking business, they were in all kind of diplomatic business, and the government really never had much against the Jews. The country was governed by an Admiral Horthy. Now, why he was an admiral, I never know, because Hungary was a landlocked country, and we didn't have any water except the Danube and a lot of swimming pools. But he was an admiral and rode on a white horse with a gorgeous uniform and was very, very impressive. Now, he had a lot of Jews in his government, but he had another thing. Also, when Hitler came to power, he sided with Hitler. So that already wrote our history from that moment on, and we knew that, and we had to know that we are on the losing side, because Hungary lost every war they'd ever been with, most of them to the Turks, and this time, with being the allies with the Nazis didn't help. But unfortunately for the Jews, that was very bad. Now, in the beginning, after the Anschluss, actually, we still had it very good. I was still a young girl going to school. And there were certain restrictions that crept into the mainstream. People who wanted to go to university and wanted to be professionals, like doctors or lawyers, they already couldn't do that when the war broke out, because there became numerus clausus. Numerus clausus meant that they selected some people that could go to university of the Jews and some who couldn't, but people could still go abroad. So one of my cousins was able to go abroad, but of course that didn't last long either, because after numerus clausus came numerus nullus, what meant zero, and none of the Jews could go to further education. Now, life was still going on pretty normal, if you can call it normal, because we really didn't have much more curtails. The other thing that happened was that the Hungarian Jewish boys were not taken into the army. They were taken into the labor force. The labor force meant that they did not have any weapons, they didn't have any uniforms, and they went in front of the army, what meant that they went to Siberia and they were digging ditches in front of the army, so a lot of them lost their lives right there and then, because the incoming Russians saw these people, and of course they shot them. So a lot of Jewish lives were already lost that way. Life still was going on pretty normal until 1944, March 19. 1944, March 19 was the beginning of the end, and it was the end of my youth. I already matriculated from the Jewish Gymnasium. I was 18 years old, and I was engaged. And that day, it was a beautiful, beautiful spring day in Budapest, and we used to walk up and down the Danube, young people. And my fiancé lived on the other side, what was the Buda side, and he made a phone call in the morning that Sunday. He says, "Marianne, don't move. Don't come out of the house." I said, "What is happening?" He said, "Well, I'm looking at the bridges of Budapest, and the German army is moving in." So the Nazis took over. What happened in the political history of the country, that Hitler was very confident that Horthy will go along with him on everything, because they were allies. And then Horthy started to not please Hitler. So Hitler was not satisfied with Horthy's regime, and he decided to march in, to take over, and as a matter of fact, Horthy was exiled, and his son was exiled, and the Germans took over. So it was like, boom, all of a sudden. We always thought, and this is human, that you think, well, it's not going to happen to me, it's not going to happen to me. We had rumors, we knew that it's happening all over. But we thought, if we lasted that long, maybe we will last even longer. Unfortunately, this was 1944, March 19. The end of the war was 11 months after. In 11 months, 600,000 Hungarian Jews were exterminated. So we caught the tail end of the war, but boy, did they move in on us. So this day, we were curtailed, and from that day on, every day another law came into effect in Jewish life in Hungary. In Budapest, it was still not as bad as in the provinces. I living in Budapest with my parents, and my grandfather lived in Budapest too. We still were moving around. But in the provinces, where all my father's and mother's brothers, sisters, cousins, nephews, and nieces were, they were already hoarded into ghettos. And there they had all the Jews in their books, and as the Germans, did, everybody was labeled, everybody was put down as a Jew, and there was absolutely no escape. And they were very clever, because what they did, the Germans, what they did is really pointed at Jewish council. So like one of my uncles was in the provinces, and he was the head of the Jewish council, and he thought that, well, by keeping an eye on every Jew in that ghetto will help everybody. Unfortunately, it only helped the Hitler regime, because they carted them all away. Anyhow, in Budapest, life still was going on, and I was supposed to get married. So my fiancé was in labor camp, but he got 3 days off, so he said, well, let's get married. Now, between March 19 and my wedding, what was April 6, a lot of things happened. First of all, Jews were not able to go anymore on the streetcars. All the Jewish businesses were closed, the radio stations were closed, the newspaper. We couldn't listen to the radios, the other radios, and Jews just couldn't walk around anymore. And April 5th, they brought in the law that every Jew has to wear a yellow star above their hearts on their outer garment. That day, that was April 5th, April 6th was my wedding. My wedding didn't take place anymore in the synagogue where we belonged because the synagogue became a stable that day for the German soldiers. So what we did is my parents still had a nice home, and since we were very religious, we had like a balcony where we had to get married open sky. That was the religious way of doing it. And there was no wedding canopy, so we got a talisim, and 4 boys were holding it up. I couldn't invite anybody except neighbors and people around because nobody was able to walk around anymore. And I got married properly, and everybody was crying, and it wasn't really what an 18-year-old girl thinks of her wedding. But anyhow, then my husband told us that we can go back to his home, was in Buda. But during the wedding lunch or dinner, there was an air raid, so everybody had to go to the air raid shelter. And then I decided, then and there, that I took off the coat where the Jewish star was sewn on the day before. And I said to myself that I will take life into my own hands, come what may. I'm not going to be labeled. I'm a very proud Jew, and I always was a very proud Jew, and I still am. But I did not want to be labeled because I knew that I take a tremendous chance if I don't wear the Jewish star. But I also take a tremendous chance if I'm labeled as a Jew and there is no way out anymore, and whatever they will do with me, they will do. So I went over to the Buddha side, and that would have been my wedding night. There was an air raid, and we spent most of the night in the air raid shelter. 5 o'clock in the morning, my husband was summoned by the officer to take him back to the camp. So that day I decided that I go back to my parents. It was Erev Passover also. So I thought, well, we'll still have some Passover in our home, in my childhood home. And I went there very early in the morning because I had to walk. And I got in, and the doorbell rang. My parents were still asleep, and I opened the door, and there was the Gestapo demanding my father. So I said, well, what do you want him for? They said, well, he was listening to the English radio. Well, everybody in their right mind was listening to the English radio 5 seconds a day or 5 minutes a day. The BBC or the Voice of America did da-da-da-dam, Beethoven's Fifth, and we knew then we get some news, we'll know what's going on in the world. So that was a false accusation, but anyhow, they dragged him out, and they took him to a gathering camp. No matter what pleas we made, they took him. Now, around the same time, a few days later, we found out that there is a man named Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, very young, from a very prominent banking family in Sweden, who came to Budapest with the sole purpose of saving Jewish lives. Now, why he did that, as Mr. Kimmel said, what motivated him, what was in his heart, nobody knows. But we do know, and in my family I certainly know, that he made miracles. In my family, 3 generations were saved because of Raoul Wallenberg. And I don't know another family among my friends, relatives, anybody where this miracle occurred. And he really did it with his own charm, with his own charisma, with his tremendous will, and this power that really we do not know, and maybe Mr. Kimmel will find out, that what motivates a person like that? He came from a very, very prominent banking family, like the Rockefellers in America, and he had a bright future. He went to the University of Michigan to become an architect. Then he went back home. And I'm sure that this organization who carries his name knows all about it. But I am telling you a personal view of him. And we had no idea why this man is doing this, but we were very eager that he should help us. So we got papers, what they call the Schutzpass. And the whole family got it. My then husband, who was in the labor camp, my parents, and me. And this piece of paper started to work miracles. The first one was the first recipient was my father. After we got the paper for him, we were able to send up a messenger to the gathering camp, what was outside of Budapest. And with this piece of paper, he was let out from the gathering camp. Now that is a very powerful piece of paper. As we found out later, that evening the whole camp was taken to Auschwitz. So he was like saved in the nick of time. We didn't know that he let him out, and of course, when he arrived on our doorstep, we rejoiced. He was already looking like a skeleton, even though it was only very short time, but he was beaten, and so, but he was alive. And we were very happy to have him back, and this is when we started to see what the Schutzpass can produce. How come, why the Gestapo thought that we were under the aegis of the Swedish king and with the Swedish flag and with the Swedish crown. We didn't ask why. We were just the recipients and were happy for it. So as life went on in Budapest, there were a lot of people who helped Raoul Wallenberg. One of them was my brother-in-law, who is now in California and also makes documentaries and speaks. But we didn't know actually what is going to happen, because day by day there were different curtailing for the Jews. The place where my parents lived became a Jewish house, but meant that lots of families had to move in and everybody had like a half a room, but we were still living, and that was the main point. And as far as I'm concerned, I was very young and I had hopes, and I thought every minute that I survive is a minute longer that maybe the war will end. In the meantime, from the provinces, they took all my relatives and all the Jews that they totally de-Jewified all of Hungary except Budapest. In the meantime, I also acquired some Christian papers, and I was hiding out in a home with a Christian woman who was a friend of my husband, and I kind of bided my time there until one day the doorbell rang. The woman was away because she was working and I was like the housekeeper. And the Gestapo, not the Gestapo came, but the Hungarian gendarmes. The Hungarian gendarmes were very awesome looking people. They were like state troopers, I would call them. And they had this uniform with feathers, and you could get scared already when you looked at them. So 5 of them came in, and there was a big dining room table, and they made me sit down, and they started to interrogate me. Now, I was supposed to be this Christian girl, so they interrogated me until I even said the catechism and everything that was necessary. And for an hour, this was going on. And finally, they got up and they said, "We didn't get you this time, but we will come back." Well, they might have gone back, but I wasn't there anymore. 5 minutes later, I took myself and went back to my parents' house. That didn't last long either, because the next law was that even the Jewish house couldn't exist anymore, and they made a ghetto in Budapest too. My grandfather moved into the ghetto. And then we found out that Raoul Wallenberg bought up buildings, big apartment buildings in Budapest, and hung out the Swedish flag, and they called these Swedish houses. So my parents moved into one of these Swedish houses. And they were absolutely, just like the paper said it, they were under the aegis of the Swedish flag and nobody can touch them. There also was a Swedish legation. The Swedish legation, my husband, who in the meantime went AWOL from the labor force, moved into the Swedish legation. By then, everybody was in the air shelter because the bombing of Budapest was horrendous. And there were bombs falling and anti-artillery fire, and it was impossible already to live in a building. So everybody was in the basement, what was the so-called air shelter. I, on the other hand, went to live with our accountant's husband, our accountant whose wife was Gentile and was in the air shelter, who was hiding her husband, who was Jewish. and he was still in the apartment. So I went to live with them as a Jew, Gentile, Swede, whatever you name it. I had also 3 sets of papers by then on myself. And I was trying to help my family and friends and the Swedish consulate because there was no food anymore. And I had gold. I had gold pieces, what they called Napoleon, but I carried around in a ficus plant. They were buried in there. And with those gold pieces, I bartered for food and essentials. And there were still some farmers who came into Budapest, and there were still some stores that carried some merchandise. So I went every morning, I went out on the streets, on the snowy streets of Budapest, and carried my wares and bartered my gold, and went to the Swedish consulate where my husband and the other Jews were, and my parents' Swedish house. I could not get to the ghetto where my grandfather was because that was impossible, but some other friends, so I tried to help as much as possible. Now, I must have been very, very young and very bold, and then you think nothing can hit you, because walking on the street by that time was very hazardous, not only because I was a Jew without the star, but also because the anti-artillery fire was booming all day long. The snipers came down and gunfire was there, and then there was the police and the gendarmes, so any minute could have stopped me, but here I am. So anyhow, this went on for a while, and New Year's Eve, December 31st, I decided I can't do this any longer, and I moved in with my husband to the Swedish legation's basement. A few days later, I went up to the 3rd floor for something, but we still had a telephone switchboard operator. And my husband said he doesn't want to come up. I wanted to do something there. So he said no. And the building was pretty much bombed out by then, so there were no windows or doors, but there were holes in the wall. And all of a sudden, I hear a lot of marching and a lot of commotion, and I look out from that hole in the window, and there comes the Nazi brigade walking into the basement and carrying everybody out. There were about 80 or 100 people in the Swedish legation, Jews like us, and they were all marched out on the snowy streets of Budapest towards the Danube. Why towards the Danube? Because by then nobody was taken to camps, trains don't go, and the Russians were almost at the doorsteps. So the solution was to take these Jews to the Danube, shoot them in, and that's the end of it. So when I saw that, there was horror in me, and my friend, who became my friend, who was at the switchboard, we called Raoul Wallenberg's office, because this was a legation and he was in another office. And we got him. And Raoul Wallenberg got into his car with his driver, went out to the Danube, and told, you cannot take these people. These are under the Swedish legation's auspices. These people are Swedes. And again, who knows why? Would you believe it, that this murderous Gestapo who was standing there with their guns, shooting down all these Jews, let them go. So 2 hours later, I was looking out on the snowy street, and there was coming back all these so-called Swedish Jews back to the legation, including my husband. And there is one little interesting thing. I never saw Raoul Wallenberg, by the way, but my husband did, my late husband. Anyhow, there was a young man in the midst of us, this is one of the Swedish Jews, who had a few diamonds on him. And the diamonds were well hidden in his pocket or something, sewn in. His mother gave it to him, and he said this might come in handy. This young man, when he was marched out in the snowy streets of Budapest, and it was snowing, he discarded the diamonds because he thought this is the end. Boy, when he was coming back, saved by Raoul Wallenberg, he looked for those diamonds, but the snow was falling heavily, could never find them. So the moral of this little story is that never give up hope. While there is life, don't give up hope. Anyhow, getting back to my story, so there was another survivor, so my husband was saved because of Raoul's interference and whatever he was able to tell these horrible murderers. The Russians were starting to come closer and closer. By then we had no hope that the Americans are going to liberate us, but we were welcoming the Russians. So as the Russians came closer and closer, about 3 days before we were liberated by the Russians, and this I only found out later, Raoul Wallenberg had an interview with Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was stationed in Budapest to do the final solution. He was the delegate of Hitler to take care of the Jews of Hungary, the final solution. Adolf Eichmann, I don't have to tell you, was what kind of a henchman he was. Raoul Wallenberg heard that Eichmann wants to blow up the ghetto before the Russians come in. And Raoul Wallenberg, in that little interview that he had with Eichmann, persuaded this horrible, murderous Eichmann not to blow up the ghetto. Now, how he did it, what he did, who knows? But he must have used some kind of a words and system, and as I said, his charisma and fantastic charm, that he probably told Eichmann that you'll be the first one who will be identified or something like that. He threatened him, actually. He did threaten him. So the ghetto was not blown up, and that's how my grandfather was saved. So you see, it's 3 generations of us that was saved because of the interference of Raoul Wallenberg. So it's no wonder he's my hero. And just like in that little movie that Mr. Kimmel was showing, everybody can be a hero, maybe not as a big hero as Raoul Wallenberg, but one man can make the difference. There were times, and there are always times even in our lives, when one person can do little deeds, little good. And you all who are sitting here and who are part of this organization know it very well, that school children learn from it. They really do, that there are such things as real heroes. There are such people who can help other people. And I think that is one of the most important things that our message can carry now. And Rachel, I'm very, very grateful that this program goes on so well, that school children find out. Of course, I put into it that I talk to children, I talk to schools, and I tell them that yes, Raoul Wallenberg is a hero, and Raoul Wallenberg is a man who made a difference and who saved so many lives. It happened in Budapest, it happened in Hungary, but there are bad times in other places in the world too, and if people would do that, it is a wonderful thing. Now, I just hope that I still believe that Raoul is somewhere around in the world. And my hope is that one of these days I can meet him, shake hands with him, and thank him for all the things he did for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne. Are there any one of you who'd like to ask Marianne Balchon questions about her experiences?
Yes, please ask questions, and I'll be happy to answer.
She told you everything.
Well, no. Yes, yes.
So this has to do with the language. It has to do with the therapeutic cleansing of one's soul and one's propagation of something that is improper. And what is improper is the word extermination, because it puts human beings on a subterranean level.
But they were.
And so I was thinking of, it's harsher, but it's more poetic and it's more dramatic, and it would be an assassination.
But it was not assassination. I'm sorry, I disagree with you.
Okay, please elaborate on that, because from a healing point of view, I have a friend who wrote the psychoanalysis of Hitler, and when I think about extermination, usually it's not on anything that you want to totally eradicate.
They totally wanted to eradicate the Jews of the world. They wanted to alienate it, they wanted to eradicate it, and the final solution meant that get rid of the Jews. Now, they preferred sometimes shooting them, sometimes gassing them, sometimes starving them, sometimes working them to death. You don't call that extermination?
Yes, correct. It is just that I'm trying to get at a healing modality as far as...
Excuse me. I appreciate your question and your discussion here. I think you know, we're really talking more about Mrs. Balchon's very own personal experiences, because she can't really answer for words that have come into usage throughout the world today over a period of 50 years. However, I think when she defines extermination and did it so brilliantly, I would doff my hat.
I did not
if I
make
had
up the
one.
word, and believe me, it hurts to say it. Yes, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, there might be an interest in knowing how you viewed the Hungarian Arrow Cross as opposed to the Nazis and the Germans who were in Budapest.
I didn't bring up in the story the Hungarian Arrow Cross, what was, of course, very significant, but I'm glad you asked. Now, historically, of course, it's very important. When Hitler marched, when the Nazis marched in, that was March. In October 15, the same year, the Hungarian Arrow Cross took over. The Hungarian Arrow Cross was a bunch of hooligans who had a leader by the name of Ferenc Szálasi, and they, instead of the swastika, they had cross with arrows on the ends, and they had that as their emblem. They had uniforms, and mainly they had big guns. And they went and rampaged all over, and everywhere they saw a Jew, that was the end, because they really just wanted to kill the Jews. They were arrogant, they were not knowledgeable, they had nothing against us except hatred. Just plain ordinary hatred, but of course is the greatest poison. They didn't know why. Most of them were very young, 17, 16, 18-year-old, as I said, you would call it in this country, hooligans, who really didn't know what it was about. They just wanted to be anti-Semites and kill the Jews, and that was the end of it. Yes. Does that answer you? And Szálasi was caught when the Russians came in, when they liberated us, and he was hung. So,
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Actually, it was the same kind of question. Think about the incident you mentioned in the Swedish headquarters when they were marched to the Danube. Wasn't that the Nyilas? Rather than
No, it was the Gestapo, it was the SS. The Nyilas did not do such things. The Nyilas were not organized enough to do such things. The Nyilas just went and killed whoever they saw whom they thought he was a Jew. Well, maybe they did, because that was easier, but not in that. When people were hoarded up like this, like the Swedish, so-called Swedish Jews, it was the Nazis.
Thank you. You know, first of all, I want to thank Marianne for sharing, because I know from talking to very many people who've been through this experience that to share these memories of so much pain and so much horror is a very, very difficult thing to do. So it's an act of courage on the part of any survivor to get up in front of a group of people and talk about the events that are indelible in terms of your life. There's just, so it's a heroic action in and of itself. So I thank you very much.